Well, good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Demystifying Complex Operations in Psychedelic Research. My name is Ryan Muse, and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation will be a panel discussion, which includes a Q&A session at the end with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Worldwide Clinical Trials, who developed the content for this presentation. Worldwide Clinical Trials is a global, mid-sized contract research organization, CRO, that provides top-performing bioanalytical and phase 1 to 4 clinical development services to the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries. Major therapeutic areas of focus include cardiovascular, metabolic, neuroscience, oncology, and rare diseases. Operating in 60-plus countries with offices in North and South America, Eastern and Western Europe, and Asia, Worldwide is powered by its more than 3,000 employee experts. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Christine Moore, PhD, the Vice President of Neuroscience Scientific Solutions, provides strategic scientific guidance across multiple programs, driving neuroscience clinical research of the highest quality for the company. With over 25 years of drug development and commercialization experience, Dr. Moore's experience extends from scientific to operational expertise across neuroscience indications with specialization in analgesia and addiction. Rolana Avramson has over 25 years clinical experience, 14 years experience in clinical trial research, and has worked for Worldwide Clinical Trials since May 2014. As the Vice President of Clinical Projects, her primary responsibilities include oversight of the operational and clinical conduct of assigned studies, including rater, CRA, and patient training, source eligibility reviews, data surveillance, sponsor reporting, and scale management. Julia Forte holds over 25 years of clinical research industry experience across a variety of indications, the majority of which is in CNS. Her current responsibilities include overseeing and providing operational advice and supporting the project managers and study teams to ensure high quality and timely delivery of these programs. And finally, our moderator for today's discussion, Richard Bennett, Senior Director and Therapeutic Strategy Lead in the Neuroscience franchise at Worldwide Clinical Trials. He has worked on neuromuscular disorders, rare diseases, clinical care, pain and palliative care, dermatology, and epidemiology programs. His direct experience working with large pharma and small and emerging biotech firms has given him a deep understanding of the needs of sponsors. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand the mic over to our moderator, Richard Bennett. You may begin when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's a pleasure for me to say thank you to all of you for dialing into today's X-Talks discussion. And I want to straight away get into the dialogue around some of the high-level fundamental elements of research with psychedelics. So I'm going to first come to Christine and ask her what I think is quite a basic scene-setting question. And that is that, well, psychedelics have been around and been in use for thousands of years. So why is it that we even need clinical trials?
Yeah, thanks, Rich, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Hope you find something useful. But why we need clinical trials, it sounds like such a basic question and one that we don't normally ask in the drug development business. Of course we need clinical trials. But here we're talking about compounds that are natural, largely, or have been used for millennia for spiritual and medicinal use. So some would argue that they should be freely available because they occur naturally. And by natural psychedelics, I'm referring to psilocybin, mescaline, ayahuasca, and synthetics like LSD and MDMA, fall a bit into a different category. But it is still a basic and relevant question. What we're trying to determine in a clinical trial is if a treatment is safe and effective, but we're also trying to determine in which patients, with which mental health conditions, with which comorbidities. How do we predict who will respond and who won't? How will we predict who will have an adverse experience and who won't? What are the conditions needed for efficacy? So those are the kinds of things that clinical trials are designed to answer, and we need to have that data for informing future prescribers how to use them properly.
Thank you, Christine. And so it seems to, stand to reason, of course, that yes, we do need clinical trials, but why is it so important to do them in the right way?
Well, ultimately, doing a trial the right way protects patients. So we need to do control studies within this regulatory framework to add as much scientific rigor as we can. It's our responsibility to do these trials well, both for those developing the treatments and for the patients themselves. And clinical trials, of course, are not cheap. So they're expensive. We don't need to expose patients to undue risk. So we really have both a fiscal and an ethical responsibility to do these trials well. And they're complex. So clinical trials in psychedelics really are a mix of art and science. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and we need to approach them all from a rigorous standpoint.
And so you used the word rigor there, Christine. Maybe you could put into a few more words. What exactly do you mean when you use that term, rigor?
Sure. So we do already have a good bit of data from fairly small academic studies with a number of broad psychedelics and a number of mental health indications. But we really need to put these to the test with larger sample sizes and more generalized sample. So again, while we have good preliminary data, we need to see how these compounds behave more broadly. And of course, use of these compounds is not without risk. So, psychedelics have a complex pharmacology. We think of them as acting mostly within the CNS, but there are serotonin receptors where psychedelics tend to, or by definition really, act within the body. There are those receptors, not just in the CNS, but in the liver, kidney, heart, stomach. And some psychedelics have non-specific interactions across several types of receptors. So we know, for example, that both psilocybin and LSD can be associated with valvular heart disease with chronic use. And we also know that there are side effects with use of psychedelics, not for everybody, but for some, that include nausea and vomiting, headache, tachycardia, psychosis-like symptoms, heightened anxiety. So all of these things need to be carefully controlled and studied in a rigorous way.
And what about if there wasn't rigor? Are there sort of any examples or any sort of theoretical possibilities of doing this work in the wrong way? Are there any warning signs that we have already, that could kind of help us signpost towards doing psychedelic research in the right way?
I think clinical trials in general are done fairly rigorously. I tend to be more concerned about what happens after clinical trials and how those data are applied or ignored. So I'll give you one example, and you can take it with a bit of a grain of salt, but we've seen, recently the approval of esketamine for acute suicidal ideation or behavior. And by the way, that was approved with a REMS in place because of the risks associated with use potentially, and it requires administration by a healthcare professional. But now we have hundreds of ketamine clinics, not S-ketamine, they are different, open in the US using ketamine off-label for major depressive disorder or treatment-resistant depression. We haven't rigorously tested the right dose of ketamine, how often it should be dosed, how frequently it can be dosed safely. So all of this has kind of led up to FDA recently issuing a health alert after a concerning number of psychiatric events with that off-label ketamine use. So doing controlled clinical trials helps us learn how to use these substances properly.
Yeah, so it's about informing, you know, what the world looks like after market approval and real world use. Yeah, so thinking about those studies, you know, we're here to talk about complex operations, and you know, by our very title, we're absolutely sort of advocating for the fact that it's different. It's different to do studies in psychedelics. So I just want to ask broadly to the group, what is it that you see makes psychedelic research unique? There must be something unique about this. What is it that you see to be the real point of discussion here? Does anybody want to comment on that? Who wants to go first?
I can take a stab at it and let Christine and Rolana chip in. But for me, it's really the complexity logistically around the different people involved. So in clinical trials, they all have their own complexities, but specifically in psychedelic research, you have the component of obviously needing somewhere to dose these patients. So the set and setting is important. That adds an added wrinkle into sort of being ready and being a site that can logistically do one of these studies. There are Rolana, who I'm sure will talk a little bit about raters, the different build-up of the study team, on top of our normal sort of clinical research team. So those that will be, you know, meeting with the patient, taking the assessments and doing all that kind of activity, along with the therapist piece. No, not all of these compounds require therapy. And by therapy, I'm using that broadly as a term for a facilitator, monitor, or therapist that will sit in the room with the patient while they're dosed. Now, depending on the compounds, some compounds have that, some compounds won't. Some compounds will have more in terms of preparatory sessions for the patients, than others, and sort of integration afterwards. But broadly, that adds a whole level of complexity to making these studies unique. And the coordination and just getting the right staff in place and the resources in place to do these studies, for me, makes them unique.
Absolutely. And to piggyback off of what you just said, Julia, and as you said, not every study will use therapists, but really a majority right now have been using some form of therapy in their model. And what we typically see in clinical trial research is the patient comes into a site, they are deemed eligible, and then they go through a series of assessments with an identified site rater using typically structured interviews, and their symptoms are assessed. We obtain the data, and then we move on to the next visit and so forth. When it comes to psychedelic research, particularly with the use of therapy, it's a really unique model in that you're combining therapy with traditional clinical trial modalities. So, and when I say therapy, I mean therapy. These patients are coming in and they're working with, as Julia mentioned, be a therapist, a facilitator, a moderator, someone in the room, typically for several hours following dosing. And what is happening is that they are now working through all of the physical experiences, the emotional experiences, frankly, psychedelic experiences that they're feeling in that time for several hours, and that will require a lot of therapy. Certainly patients that are coming in to participate in these trials can have a great deal of psychological history, trauma that will come to surface, and the therapist is there to help them work through it. And that is very much separate from the traditional site rater. So we're not just working with sites to do these assessments. We're working with a number of different professionals with various backgrounds to come and support the patient and support the clinical trial. But again, if we're using therapists, it still needs to be done in the right setting, as Julia mentioned and as Christine mentioned, with rigor. And so having the right therapist identified is absolutely critical. Selecting those who have gone through training specific for this type of, for the chosen therapeutic approach. There are many different types of therapies. These tend to be more manualized forms of therapy. So it can't be just someone who identifies as a psychotherapist, but one who's gone through a specific training, matching the therapist up with the patient, having the right backgrounds, even how they present themselves, and including gender. So all of that is really taken into account for studies like this. And again, as I mentioned, therapies tend to be manualized. The setting, again, even though it's therapy, we still want rigor. So there needs to be some form of standardization. So the settings themselves, we think about the room, what kind of music is playing, the look of the room, what color are the walls, are there plants in the room? These are also taken into account, because even though the patients are coming in with their own histories, and therapy, of course, will go where the patient needs to go, these are certain aspects that we can control and bring in some more rigor to these trials. Additionally, for quality control purposes, teaching purposes, many of these sessions are either video or audio recorded as well. And that's something that is also shared with the patients before they participate.
So I'm just listening to what you say there, and you know, at one end of the extreme, you've got sort of rigor. You've then got the experience, people witnessing, observing, and supporting during the experience. Yet, you know, the sort of customary sort of gold standard for a clinical trial is that it would be blinded, controlled, all those other things that we're very much used to. So what are the main considerations here with blinding a study in psychedelics?
That is a very significant consideration that is top of mind. You know, I think that in any type of psychiatric research, we're always concerned about maintaining the blind, controlling for a placebo effect, right? Even without the absence of a placebo arm. And so we're always concerned about that. And this is absolutely critical when we're talking about this type of research, psychedelic research, because we're using therapists. And what we're always told in clinical trials is you must maintain appropriate research alignment. You must maintain an appropriate degree of neutrality. It's not to influence the data in some way, control for variability, control for all these extraneous factors that can influence patient responses on their questionnaires. And so obviously with the introduction of therapy, we're adding a bit of a wrinkle to this. Not to mention, we also have the potential for what we call functional unblinding. So that means that patient's presentation, just by nature of taking some form of psychedelic, you're going to see a physical change in the patient, whether it has to do with how their pupils are reacting, whether it's how they're moving, how they're speaking. So it can automatically signal to someone who is responsible for the data, for the ratings, that this patient was dosed. And so we need to control for that as well. So there are several things that we can do and we can institute to try and control for the blind and to, again, make this as rigorous process as possible. So when we're talking about controlling for the blind, we have to understand that there are two very distinct roles working with the patient. You have the therapists who are responsible for, again, the therapy. They can have that therapeutic alliance. They should have that therapeutic alliance because they're working with the patient in such a deep way. And then you have what we typically call psych raters or psychometric raters. They don't have to be at the site, but these raters are responsible for the data that we're getting from the patients. This is through semi-structured or structured interviews, looking at symptom severity. And so they should be wholly independent from the site. They should be wholly independent from the therapist. Oftentimes a central rating service is used, or it can be somebody identified by the site or the investigator as one who has the experience to do these ratings. Again, they would be kept completely independent of everything else related to the trial and the patient's therapy. And that is one way to maintain the blind. We can institute, we typically do institute some blinding questionnaires to test the robustness of the blind, like a blinding integrity questionnaire and similar. The other thing that is really very important to take into account is that we need to do very thorough placebo-response research alliance training specifically for those psychometric raters and the site staff as well, because the patients are going to oftentimes come in with a level of expectation for how this drug may help them. We have a lot of patients who will want to enroll in these trials because there's a degree of desperation. You know, this nothing else has helped me. This is something new. Maybe this will make an impact, or maybe they knew other patients who have participated in similar trials and have heard their stories, or they did their research, and they're coming in with some level of expectation or belief that there will be a benefit. So it's very important to talk with the patients, to get an understanding, level set their expectations and beliefs about participating in a trial. Educate them. What does it mean for you to participate? What does this trial, what is this going to look like? These are the specific roles. This is the role of your therapist. This is the role of the person who will be doing these interviews with you. So they understand that not every aspect of the trial will give them a therapeutic benefit. And again, and everyone who participates, depending on what role it is, they'll know just how they should present with the patients.
Mm-hmm. And maybe, Christine, I can just ask you, I've sort of understood that there's, you know, this kind of idea of microdosing. So are there any differences on kind of the expectation setting and also the consequence on blinding with a different kind of protocol?
Yeah, so microdosing, you know, essentially refers to, it's more like a typical pharmacotherapy where you use small doses at frequent intervals for an indefinite period of time. If there is a mystical experience with microdosing, it's often very mild or not even noticeable. So in that model, it's not necessarily combined with therapy. It looks more, or can look more like a traditional trial.
Mm-hmm. And so I suppose you still undertake the same rigorous ways of trying to ensure the study's blinded and perhaps have less risk towards that, but still go through the same measures.
Sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, Rolana, you've talked at length there about the different personnel involved and some of the sort of unique special things that are needed. But as you're sort of heading up the clinical assessment technologies group at Worldwide, are there any other parts of the kind of the services that you offer that are really specific to psychedelics and rating efficacy?
Yeah, again, we do support the sites and the studies in terms of helping them set up certain things that would help them to control for the blind and control for functional unblinding. So that's training those independent raters on those efficacy assessments. Really, they have to come in knowing that when they're doing these assessments, they're using, as I mentioned, the structured interview guide, training the raters on how to use that assessment with that guide, but also knowing that the patients may start talking about their psychedelic or mystical experiences is actually expected, and making sure that that actually does not negatively impact or incorrectly, affect their ratings, because there are some assessments that could potentially pathologize the patient if they're talking about those experiences. But the reality is the patient did go through some experiences based on the drug that they were given. Again, also making sure that the raters do not veer into therapy with the patients is something that we need to very much be aware of, is that these assessments, even though they're structured or semi-structured, manualized, the patient is going to talk about very serious and deep issues with the assessor. They're talking about, for instance, if it's a depression assessment, they're talking about their depressive symptoms, they're talking about their anxiety and what's making them feel anxious, or maybe what's contributing to feelings of guilt, and it uncovers a lot of sensitive material. It's very easy for these assessments to also veer into a therapeutic territory. So making sure that the raters who are chosen to participate have a full understanding that they need to veer back into an appropriate research lines. They are not the therapists. Therapists are their own group. They go through their own training, and it's extremely different from the training that a site rater or an independent rater would go through. So it's very, very important to make sure that that distinction is made and the manner of training follows appropriately.
Well, I guess that's kind of efficacy covered. And what about safety assessment? I assume that there must be some particular measures that we need to undertake on looking after the patients that are in these studies.
Yeah, I can address that a bit, Rich. Thanks. So we're taking an already vulnerable patient population and putting them in an even more vulnerable state of altered consciousness during a psychedelic dosing session. So usually in trials where set and setting and therapy is involved, that therapy is generally one or more, 2 or 3 prep sessions to inform the patients what to expect, that it might be a difficult or challenging experience, as Rolana mentioned. Then during dosing itself, usually there's 2 people in the room, 2 therapists or 1 lead therapist and a monitor that already have an established rapport with the patient. So there's already a level of trust built and boundaries discussed for what the patient prefers should happen if the experience becomes difficult or challenging. And then, as Rolana also mentioned, those sessions are usually videotaped and reviewed. And then after dosing, we need to pay attention to any adverse events that occur later on, along with documenting if symptoms change, like if there's a worsening of depression, if that worsening was due to the treatment itself, or if it's because the patient didn't have the experience they had hoped for and now have more of a hopelessness about them. That requires regular check-ins with the patient. We also need to closely monitor suicidality, and with a specific plan in place should it occur, not only at the research site, but in organizations like ours, looking at safety listings and establishing data alerts from scales that we collect and things like that. But I think perhaps most importantly, once those dosing sessions and integration sessions are over, therapy should not come to an abrupt halt for these patients. So again, they've likely formed a bond and trust with the therapist, and ideally they can continue that psychotherapy if still needed. But if they can't with that particular therapist, there needs to be a collaborative referral plan in place and continuity of care for the patients.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
even just if I may jump in, just even from a practical standpoint too, after they go through dosing, to actually ensure that they have the right support in their environment, that they are not to drive after that session, and to have something in place there so they can get home safely as well. So just even from that, from a logistical standpoint, these are things that we need to consider.
Yeah, and usually, well, in fact, in all cases, I think they have an on-call psychiatrist available during the dose session that's separate, just in case there are any incidents during that.
Yeah, so we sort of moved on there to kind of thinking really about the very practical and operational things, which kind of just made me sort of chuckle to myself, because I guess that's what we're here to absolutely delve into. I asked you all the question of kind of what makes these studies unique, and I suppose we haven't said it yet, but I suppose it's the compound themselves, right? So yeah, I don't know, Julia, what are those things that we have to consider with working with psychedelics when you think of them as like a class of agents?
Yeah, well, I think they're definitely unique because most of them fall into Schedule 1 category. So, I mean, what that practically means is, and I'm sure a lot of people listening are aware, you have to get the licensing in place in order to move the drug around and then ultimately be able to prescribe it in your clinical research trial. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So both of those items require upfront planning and thought. So you need to, initially, when you're planning out your trial, I would strongly recommend you think about where that's going to be conducted and what sort of controls there are for the countries that you are considering, and build that into your timelines, because that can become quite quickly, that can go onto your critical path. So just to expand a bit more, I mean, just to pick a couple of countries that are easy to talk to. So the US, for example, they have the FDA, the DEA, sorry, is in charge of the licensing. And what you have to do if you pick a site is establish if they have any state requirements around controlled drug licensing. If they have a separate review board, like in California, they have a review board that meets every 2 months, that they need to review your controlled drug study. So you need to factor that into your approval timelines, and then you need to factor in the licensing, and it's always a researcher license for this Schedule 1 type of drug. You need to factor in if it's a site that has no Schedule 1 experience, that will be a new application, or whether they have Schedule 1 in place, which would be an update with this approved clinical research protocol. And all of that can take sort of between adding to a site that has an existing Schedule 1 license, potentially it could take 1 to 2 months after you get a study approval. And if you don't have a Schedule 1 license in place, I mean, that can take anywhere between 3 and sort of, we've known it take like 12 months, because you need to have a site inspection, you need to have, there are various different pieces to this whole process that take time to get to sort of schedule and get done. Yeah, I'll pause there for a sec.
Well, you just made me think, Julia, is an inspection a one-off event, or are you at risk of being inspected throughout the course of a study then?
So I think inspections actually last a certain amount of time, and I think they're different to the country. And I think once you've been inspected, I can't remember if it's a 3 or 5 year cycle in the US. I think it's definitely it's something like that in the UK. But other things to consider as well, of course, are, I guess, if any of the parameters on what you were issued your original license change. So let's take a drug that's easy to talk about, so room temperature storage, for example, and you've been qualified or inspected on that basis, then if your next study has a similar requirement, it's again room temperature, I think you'd be okay. You'd have your storage wouldn't need to be assessed. But then say that you maybe go to refrigerated storage, then I think you need to build that in again, because you may need an inspection to check that that's up to standards. And again, I would say out of the predominantly we're talking about sort of mainstream studies having been done in Western, now branching into Eastern Europe, North America, and we're seeing some happen in Asia Pac, so sort of in Australia and New Zealand. But those are sort of the mainstream areas, potentially Middle East. Yeah, so we're quite familiar with those sort of regulations, environments, and it's ever changing as well. And one thing is never quite clear, but always when you establish, you need, the lists are not up to date. If you go on the DEA website and look for your compound, you may find it, you might not. Certainly the Home Office, you might find it or not. You have to get in contact with these people and find out, what this is the compound we're working with, what are the licensing requirements for it.
So it sounds like there's another level of proactivity needed in the startup phase then. Talking about the drug, what are the extra requirements for sort of drug handling, and can everybody do it, or is that also subject to licensing?
That's also subject to licensing, and actually that's a very sort of topical discussion point at the moment, because not all of the vendors that we're used to working with that could routinely do this can handle Schedule 1s because of the licensing and the fact that, sort of alluded to, if it requires certain other storage, if we're talking refrigerated storage, they don't all have the ability to be able to do that. So it is something that you need to start thinking about early on in your sort of when you have your protocol synopsis. I would even say, who are you going to work with to distribute this product for you and handle it? So that is key, because it can take, if they don't have a license already in place, it can take up to 12 months to get your facility license.
Right. And at the site, more robust requirements on pharmacy while at the site, or do sites sort of do this without a pharmacy?
It really depends, and that sort of gets into sort of sites, somewhat touches on site selection and different types of sites that has historically been involved. You can have your drug sitting with the investigator, or it could sit in pharmacy, but wherever it's sitting, it needs to be licensed. So you need to have a license to cover. And typically, if you work with pharmacies, I would say quite a lot of pharmacies do have Schedule 1 licensing in place, or at least a process around it, and they do have that. And there are strict sort of guidelines around that. Considerations, obviously, where your pharmacy is located, how you then move it to where you're actually dosing, because that might, they might not be right next door to each other, and those sort of considerations you need to think about when you're maybe getting into site selection.
And actually, I know that we've actually made a little tool that we're going to share to everybody that's dialing into this about site selection. Actually, there's one about patient selection as well. So that frames the next two main topics for us, I think. So maybe I could just ask, sites, are these professional sites, academic sites? What kind of sites are currently involved in research with psychedelics?
I think traditionally, a few years ago, when we sort of started off mainstream, if you like, industry-sponsored trials, I think we were seeing more of the academic side and the interest from the academic side. And I think obviously academic research has been ongoing in psychedelics before this started in sort of industry-sponsored studies. And I think we're gradually seeing sort of a transition towards your mainstream clinical trial site wanting to get involved and do these studies. So there are and obviously the advantage to sort of starting up with a clinical trial site that's maybe, depending on your indication, recruited in that area and recruited well, they're already geared up to the sort of patient recruitment aspect. They don't need to establish a patient pathway and where they're coming from. They've already got that bit established. So then they need to be sort of upskilled in the psychedelic component. So we've seen it sort of move, but I think it's very much a mix, and there's very much there's a lot of academic interest in this area of research.
And when doing feasibility, how do you sort of standardize things across sites? Because I think I was hearing from Rolana that things need to be, particularly standardized, and you talked about the set and setting, and obviously, Julia and I, we both got the memo about, we need to have a plant, but obviously we've got very different size plants and a very different background. So what, how do you go about standardizing that? Is this all sort of rigorously, to use that word again, documented, mapped out, or are there, certain boundaries that are set, or how precise is this kind of thing for standardization?
I think it's very protocol specific, and it's linked into when Rolana was talking about the therapist training program and the manual. The setting is very much linked to that, but generally there is a basic requirement for these rooms to have sort of, Rolana touched on it, a bed in there, a low bed, not to be too clinical looking, to have somewhere where you can record for adherence monitoring and just for safety, and that type of thing. There's a basic sort of premise that the rooms will have that. Rolana touched on sound, on the music that will be played, and also the location. Again, it's very protocol specific, because if you're in the dosing room all day, you don't want people trying to walk off to find the bathroom, for example. You want to have that in close proximity. So these are some of the considerations. And then again, it is down to how much do you want to control for that? Do you want to go to the level of providing all of your centres with exactly the same furniture and kitting them out, or do you want to give them a general specification on what sort of things you're looking for, and then they set themselves up?
Yeah, and just very quickly then, Christine, do we know if this kind of thing has an impact on the outcome of studies? I guess, that's kind of an obvious question. We know that setting up a room, it sounds like some of the things that Julia was talking about are kind of for the well-being of the people involved, but what about the actual sort of scientific outcome? Do we know if it makes a difference?
I don't think we really have a good answer to does that make a difference. But what we try to do in a clinical trial is to control for any non-specific effects. If there's a drug or placebo or whatever we're using for a placebo, it might be a low dose, it might be a different active compound, that any differences we see between groups is due to the combination of drug and therapy. So we're trying to control for non-specific effects, at least in earlier phase 2 trials, where we're really trying to see what the drug's effects are.
It makes a lot of sense, of course. So that's kind of, I guess, general infrastructure at sites. I promised that we'd touch on selecting the right patient, didn't I? So who wants to go first in kind of outlining what we do about selecting the right patient?
I'll add a few things, and I know Rolana has a few things of her own to add, but we're looking for any history of psychosis, or sometimes even history of psychosis in first-degree relatives may not be a good candidate for a psychedelic study. We're also looking at other concomitant medications. Can they take SSRIs or not? That's very protocol and drug specific. We tend to also exclude patients with substance use disorders. But there are other considerations for, do they have a caregiver and family support? And Rolana, I know you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, we need to think about, have they had prior psychedelic experience, and what has that experience been like? of course, number one, what's the indication under study, right? So making sure that the patients actually do meet the diagnostic criteria for that particular indication. Treatment-resistant depression is at the front runner, if you will. But there are other depressive-related disorders that have been under study, using psychedelics, PTSD, other anxiety disorders. So really picking that indication and accurately diagnosing the patient using, again, their history, but a structured interview guide for that as well, because that will allow us to exclude a lot of those diagnoses that Christine just mentioned. I want to note that personality disorders are also one that we oftentimes exclude as well. They're not the ideal candidates. Something to consider when we're talking about psychiatry, comorbidities are very common. In many cases, it's to be expected. So that should not necessarily exclude a patient, but when they're being assessed for eligibility, what needs to be determined is what is the primary area of concern for them. Is it that if, for instance, the indication under study is major depressive disorder, is it the depression that is causing the most, excuse me, is it that, it's impacting them the most from a functional, emotional, social, economic perspective, or is it potentially something else, like an eating disorder? Perhaps that is the primary area of focus for the patient. So really making that determination, what is the top diagnosis, if you will, for the patient. So these are other things to certainly consider, and thinking about, I think I alluded to this earlier, thinking about the patient's environment, their support system as well. There may be some trials where it would behoove everyone to include caregivers. And so does the patient have adequate caregiver support, ranging from logistics to getting the patient to and from the site, to making sure that the patient is not alone and they can look after them, depending on what the needs are for the trials. These are things that we often take into account.
And actually, just to add, the caregiver one's a good one, because sometimes, depending on the indication, that's actually mandated, depending on where you go, by the regulators. And also, a consideration is you want to bring the caregiver along with you. So depending on the indication, if you're looking at, say, cancer, and then looking at depression or something else with it, and using a psychedelic, you really want the caregivers on board there, because these people have been through a lot of different treatments. Their caregiver might have a large say in whether they go into the study, so you really need to consider them and whether they're going to be involved in making decisions along with the patient.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I'm going to leave us with one question, and I want you all to come up with your number one thing. If you could think of, we've talked about rigor, we've talked about uniqueness, we talked about the complex operations. If you could leave the people that have dialed in and listened to us discuss this for the last 40 minutes, if you could leave them with kind of one message around how to get started in psychedelics, or the number one thing they should really pay heed to, what would that be? So I don't know who wants to go first. Julia?
Yeah, for me, I would say really consider your timelines and planning, and build in the drug licensing aspect, because that by far, a lot of people obviously want to get their studies completed in their but in the quickest possible time frame. And you really need to plan for the controlled aspects, get your vendor sorted out, as I mentioned, and get the drug licensing sorted out at sites in order to be able to start in a timely manner.
Great. Christine?
Sure. So, I think I mentioned that these trials are a mix of art and science, but they can be done well. They can be done with rigor, and they can be done in a timely manner, which ultimately matters to both our drug developer partners and to patients. And I just want to add that contract research organizations are in a bit of a unique position because we see many studies from many different sponsors, and we learn from the variety of studies that we see and do what works well and what doesn't. So with all of the things to consider in planning and doing these well, it's important, and I think it's really helpful.
Great. And then finally, Rolana.
Let's not forget about the patients. It's all about the patients. What we do at the end of the day, it's to help people. It's about the patients. They are our #1 partner in research. So everything that we're setting up, and we're talking about rigor, and we're standardizing, and we want to make sure that data is clean, and we're following all of the regulatory guidelines and rules. All of that is absolutely critical. We need to think about the patient. Let's not lose sight of who's coming in and how are we designing these studies, thinking about burden, thinking about how we can support them and do research with them as a partner.
Great. Thank you all. So that concludes the areas that I wanted to probe into with the three of you. And thanks so much for coming along with that and providing us all with the information and the insights that you have from all the studies that you've been part of. We'll hand back over to Ryan now, and Ryan should hopefully have collected some questions from the audience that we can then tackle.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for that wonderfully insightful presentation. Before we get into our Q&A, I'd like to remind the audience that there's a handouts module within the GoToWebinar control panel where you'll find some additional documentation related to today's presentation to download for some further reading. I'd also like to invite the audience to continue sending their questions or comments right now using the questions window for this Q&A portion of our webinar. I've already got some questions here for you, so we'll get ourselves started with those. The very first question I have here would like to know, how do you foresee patient access once a compound like this is approved?
I'll take that one. Thanks, Ryan. So this is something that's on everybody's mind because, as you can imagine, 2 or 3 prep sessions, an 8-hour dosing session, 2 or 3 integration sessions or more, with 2 therapists potentially. The concern is that this is not going to be scalable and accessible to all patients once something is approved. So it's something on everybody's mind that we're all working towards something that is going to be scalable and accessible to patients. But I foresee, clinics that are prepared to provide psychedelics across several indications and across several types of psychedelics within that one clinic. But we're working on making this the treatment paradigm scalable.
Excellent, very good. Thank you very much for that. I've got another question here wondering, how did recruitment go? Were timelines met? Are there any success stories to share overcoming challenges to increase enrollment or reduce fail rate, etc.?
Yeah, I can start us off. I will pick the overcoming challenges because there's a few bits of that question to increase recruitment. I would say at the offset, that is another critical it can be on your critical path. So when you select your site, you need to establish what their recruitment pathway looks like and where they're going to get these patients from. And that sort of touches a little bit on when I mentioned, so we started doing these trials with maybe academic sites, and the patient pathway developed through a lot of effort in starting those studies. And then where we are now, we sort of talked a little bit about getting the more traditional clinical trials up to speed with doing some of this psychedelic research. And I think the more traditional clinical trial site have the patient pathways already established. But it is key to sit down. I mean, every indication is different. So you need to really establish where they're coming from. Are they their own pool of patients? Are they getting them from referrals? That type of thing is key to figure out and help. Are they sort of average, what type of advertising they're doing. Typically, we don't see large advertising campaigns here. We see more targeted local media campaigns that are generally more successful. But there's all these different types of considerations when you're selecting your sites at the start of your study that you need to consider to help with your patient recruitment pathways. Also, I mean, this is like for any clinical trial, sites can be spending that upfront time with their resources, trying to identify suitable patients while they're ready to get going, so sort of pre-screening. And that touches on a key thing. We're seeing here sort of some of these more traditional sites that have been involved in this type of research becoming overloaded with resources. We haven't talked about that and the need to sort of diversify and spread out where we run these studies. I'm just trying to think, reducing screen fail. I'll let Christine take that one, if you like, Christine.
Sure. So screen fail rates are typically high anyway in psychiatric trials, no matter what drug you're looking at. That tends to be a matter of the specific entry criteria, of course. And we always look to opening those up when we can for larger phase 3 trials. But if you are a sponsor with a drug under development, you should plan for fairly high screen fail rates. 50% is not usual in any psychiatric trial.
Yeah. And Ryan, just to close, because there are 2 other bits, I really want to acknowledge them. How did recruitment go and where timelines met? It's sort of it's a very study specific question, but what I will say to try and answer that in a non-specific way is that it always takes longer than you think it's going to take to recruit in these studies. So it's becoming an ever increasing, more crowded space. We have a small pool of sites that we're trying to expand, but there is a huge impact on site resources. So you need to think about that and really consider a realistic recruitment target. And we've sort of touched on ways to maybe help that.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for that wonderfully in-depth answer. I've got another question here wondering, do you find it challenging resourcing these studies in terms of CRA primarily? Does Worldwide have specific training in place for study teams assigned to these studies?
That's a great question. Oh, go on, Chris.
No, that's okay. I'll be quick. You know, we do tend to therapeutically align our study teams. So we have several CRAs, many CRAs that are experienced with psychiatric trials. We do have specific training programs in place. I do some of that training, Julia does some of that training, and so does Rolana. From multiple perspectives, we train the CRAs and study teams to work within a psychedelic space specifically. So Rolana and Julia, since you do these as well, you probably both have additional comments there.
Yeah, I was just about to say we do, I mean, exactly what you said, Christine. And in addition, we do lessons learned. So we sort of, you know, take anything that has worked well or not worked so well across studies that we've done and then, you know, learn from that and pass that on to the teams that work. So we absolutely, that's part of the ongoing training.
Mm-hmm. And in addition, with my department that I had, the Clinical Assessment Technologies Division, we are specifically training not only the raters on the assessments, but we do train the study team members as well on the assessments that are being used, and also you know, what to look out for, the differences between therapists and raters and so forth, everything that I spoke about earlier. So our teams are really well trained across the board.
And I guess I could just wrap up with the fact that the 4 of us, sorry, are part of a psychedelic center of excellence at Worldwide, which is actually a big cross-functional team working across all of the drug development value chain. So it just goes to show that we do a lot of knowledge sharing and we put a lot of focus into this. So anything that we learn, you know, all the way through from writing development plans through to executing late phase clinical trials, that all gets kind of boiled down into training material, as Christine mentioned, so that the CRAs can be upskilled and just generally well informed about what's going on in the area.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that answer and for all of the answers today. However, we have reached the end of the Q&A portion of the webinar. If we couldn't attend to all the questions, the team at Worldwide Clinical Trials will follow up with you, or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the addresses on your screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I've also sent you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll be able to view the recording of this event on this page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me once more in thanking our speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope that you all found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.